The hangar glowed like a palace of glass and steel, its vast doors thrown open to reveal rows of polished jets gleaming under golden spotlights. Music drifted through hidden speakers, a slow jazz tune competing with the hum of wealthy voices. Waiters in white gloves wove through clusters of men in tailored suits and women in silk gowns, balancing trays of champagne that fizzed like liquid gold. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume, leather seats, and jet fuel. It wasn't just an event, it was a declaration of power, wealth on display in its purest form. At the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore. His suit, custom cut in midnight blue, looked as if it had been sewn directly onto him. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place, and his watch, a limited edition piece worth more than most people's homes, caught the light every time he lifted his glass. He was in his element. Here, among the elite, Whitmore thrived. Every handshake was a performance, every smirk a reminder that he belonged to a tier above the rest. But what Whitmore loved most wasn't the admiration. It was the power he found in ridicule. To him, humiliation was a sport, and tonight he was already hunting for prey. The laughter in the hangar softened when a figure appeared at the edge of the room. She didn't belong, and everyone knew it instantly. Deborah Williams stepped through the doorway carrying a worn duffel bag that sagged at the corners. Her clothes, though neat, bore the weight of time, faded fabric, shoes scuffed from miles of walking. Her shoulders were straight, but her eyes carried something else, hesitation, as if she already sensed she was trespassing into a world that had no place for her. The polished floor reflected her steps, every sound of her worn shoes echoing against the marble-like surface. Heads turned, whispers rose. Whitmore noticed her immediately, his lips kiosk, uriled into the kind of smile that promised cruelty. He raised his voice, making sure it carried through the entire hangar. "Well, what do we have here?" He gestured toward Deborah with his champagne glass. "Did someone leave the service door open? Or maybe the cleaning crew wandered in early?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp and shallow, as dozens of eyes locked on the woman. Deborah paused in the middle of the room, the duffel still slung over her shoulder. She didn't flinch, though the heat of their stares pressed down on her like a spotlight. Whitmore wasn't done. He set his glass aside and stepped forward, voice dripping with mockery. "Tell me, ma'am, what brings you to a place like this? These jets cost more than entire neighborhoods. You don't look like someone who can even afford the taxi ride here." The crowd roared. Some covered their mouths to hide their smirks, but their eyes betrayed their amusement. For them, this was entertainment, a cruel little show served on silver platters. Deborah stood still, her face unreadable. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, and Whitmore waited for her to shrink, to excuse herself, to scurry back into the shadows where he believed she belonged. But instead, Deborah slowly set her duffel down by her feet. She lifted her gaze and locked eyes with him. There was no anger in her look. No shame, only a quiet strength, as though she had already measured the weight of his arrogance and found it small. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and utterly calm. "I know more about these planes than you think." The hangar went still. The laughter faltered, suspended in midair. Whitmore blinked, momentarily thrown off, and for the first time that evening, the crowd leaned in, not to laugh, but to listen. That single sentence, delivered with such quiet certainty, shifted something in the room. A spark had been lit, and though no one yet understood how, it promised a fire that none of them could contain. The silence after Deborah's words seemed to stretch forever. For the first time all night, the hangar full of billionaires and their polished laughter felt uncertain. The woman standing there in her faded jacket and worn shoes hadn't flinched beneath the spotlight of humiliation. She hadn't bowed her head or walked away. Instead, she had spoken with a calmness that unsettled the air around her. Richard Whitmore's smile faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. He couldn't afford weakness in front of his audience. His ego was too sharp, too hungry to let this moment pass without turning it back into his victory. He chuckled, low at first, then louder, until it echoed off the hangar's steel beams. "You know about these planes?" he repeated, drawing out the words like they were a joke only he understood. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, his leather shoes clicking against the floor. "Please, enlighten us. What could you possibly know? Do you even know which way the nose points?" The crowd erupted again. Some laughed too loudly, desperate to remain on Whitmore's side, while others chuckled nervously, still caught on the confidence in Deborah's eyes. Deborah didn't move. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides, her shoulders steady. She didn't give him the satisfaction of flinching. Her calm only made him angrier. Whitmore stopped a few steps from her, towering over her with a predator's grin. He raised his voice, making sure everyone heard him. "Tell you what, let's make this interesting. He pointed to the largest jet on display, his own gleaming $20 million aircraft, polished to perfection under the hangar lights. "That's my jet. She's the crown jewel of this collection. If you know so much, why don't you show us?" A murmur rippled through the room. A few guests gasped. They thought he was joking, and maybe he was, but the cruelty in his eyes suggested it otherwise. Whitmore smirked and spread his arms. "Go ahead. If you can so much as start that plane, let alone get it in the air, I'll hand it over to you. Keys, title, everything. The jet will be yours." The hangar filled with laughter again, but this time it was tinged with disbelief. No one thought the woman had a chance. This was theater, a spectacle designed to break her spirit and prove Whitmore's dominance. Deborah's eyes flicked to the aircraft. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not fear, but recognition. She gazed at the plane as though it were an old companion, one she hadn't seen in years. Her lips pressed together and she exhaled slowly. Whitmore misread the silence as hesitation. He leaned closer, his voice mocking, sharp. "What's the matter? Afraid? Don't worry, sweetheart. No one expected you to know anything. We'll forgive you if you walk away now. Save yourself the embarrassment." The crowd laughed again, waiting for her to fold, but Deborah lifted her chin, steady and unbroken. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and Whitmore. When she spoke, her voice was clear, strong enough to carry across the hangar. "I'll take your bet." The hangar froze. Glasses stopped midair, laughter cut off, conversation silenced. No one had expected her to accept. Whitmore's grin faltered again, just for a heartbeat, before he quickly plastered arrogance back onto his face. "You'll take it?" he repeated, mocking her words. "You? A homeless woman with a duffel bag? You think you can fly my jet?" "I don't think," Deborah said softly. "I know." The stillness that followed was different this time. It wasn't filled with amusement. It was heavy with anticipation, a tension that made hearts beat faster. Even those who had laughed the loudest felt something shift deep inside them, though they couldn't explain why. Whitmore 4. For the first time in years, he had the unsettling feeling that he might have underestimated someone. And as Deborah turned her gaze back to the plane, her expression unreadable, a quiet suspense gripped the hangar. Something was about to happen, something none of them could have imagined. The hangar doors rattled faintly as a gust of evening wind swept through, carrying the scent of jet fuel and cool night air. Deborah didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the gleaming aircraft, her duffel bag bouncing gently against her hip with each stride. The laughter that had filled the hangar only moments before had dimmed into an uneasy silence, broken now only by the faint hum of generators keeping the showcase lights alive. Every eye followed her. Whitmore trailed behind with his entourage, his laughter loud but hollow. "By all means," he called, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let's give the lady her moment. This should be worth every drop of champagne in this place." Deborah didn't look back. She moved with a strange certainty, though her clothes and weary face told the story of someone life had tried to break. When she reached the jet, she stopped for a moment. Her hand rose almost without thought and touched the smooth curve of the fuselage. Her fingers lingered there, tracing the cold metal with the reverence of someone greeting an old friend. It wasn't just a touch, it was recognition. Her lips moved in a whisper, words too soft for the crowd to hear, just like the 737s. A murmur passed through the guests closest to her. Some frowned, puzzled, others dismissed it as gibberish. But a retired pilot in the corner straightened, narrowing his eyes at her with sudden curiosity. He had recognized the tone, the way she said it, not as a guess, but as memory. Whitmore saw her pause and smirked. "What's the matter? Forget which button starts the radio?" his friends chuck. Led, though less confidently than before. Something about the way Deborah stood there, hand resting on the jet's skin, unsettled even them. She finally lowered her hand and stepped closer to the stairs leading up to the cockpit. The polished metal reflected her worn shoes, the dull leather creased from miles of walking. She tightened her grip on the railing and climbed slowly, each step echoing through the cavernous hangar. At the top, she paused and turned her gaze outward. From that height, the entire crowd was spread before her, men and women in designer suits, their faces upturned, waiting to see her fail. Her eyes swept across them, calm, unwavering. And for just a second, Whitmore thought he saw something that chilled him. Not fear, not shame, but command. Inside the cockpit, the leather still smelled new, the dashboard gleamed with polished glass screens, and the switches waited like soldiers ready for orders. Deborah slid into the captain's seat without hesitation. Her hand moved instinctively to the throttle, her eyes scanning the instruments in a rhythm that seemed too precise, too familiar for a woman who was supposed to know nothing. The hangar was silent now. Not a single laugh broke the air. The only sound was the faint rustle of her fingers brushing over switches, her lips moving as she muttered to herself, "Battery on. Avionics check. Fuel pumps." Her voice was quiet, almost like prayer, but to those who knew the language, it was unmistakable. A pre-flight checklist. Down below, Whitmore forced another laugh, though his throat was tight. "She's just pretending. Anyone can flip a few switches." But the retired pilot who had noticed her earlier leaned forward now, his face pale. He whispered to the man beside him, "That's not pretending. That's procedure. She knows exactly what she's doing." The whisper spread like a spark through the crowd. Head S turned, murmurs rose, and suddenly, the spectacle wasn't funny anymore. Something was happening that no one, not even Whitmore, had expected. Deborah reached for the headset resting on the side panel. With steady hands, she slipped it over her ears, adjusted the mic, and without hesitation, pressed the transmission button. Her voice was calm, professional, carrying the weight of experience. "Tower, this is Captain Williams requesting clearance for systems check." The room froze. Even Whitmore stopped smiling. And then, from the radio, came a crackle of static followed by a voice, firm, respectful, and astonishing. "Captain Williams, welcome back. It's been too long." The hangar erupted, not in laughter but in gasps. Shock rippled through the room like an earthquake, and Richard Whitmore, for the first time that evening, felt the foundation of his arrogance begin to crack. The cockpit lights flickered to life as Deborah's fingers moved across the controls with deliberate precision. Switch by switch, system by system, she awakened the jet as though it were an extension of her own body. The low hum of power surged through the fuselage, vibrating softly under her hands. The massive aircraft, once nothing more than a display of wealth, now responded to her touch like a loyal companion, recognizing its master. Down below, the hangar was no longer filled with laughter. The crowd stood frozen, champagne glasses trembling in their hands, conversations silenced. The glow of the instrument panel reflected against Deborah's face, sharpening the calm determination in her expression. Richard Whitmore, still trying to salvage control, forced a chuckle, though it sounded strained. "Anyone can flip a few switches," he said again, louder this time, as if volume alone could convince the others. "She's probably memorized a YouTube video." But no one laughed. Not this time. Instead, the murmurs in the hangar grew heavier, skeptical eyes shifting from Whitmore to the woman in the cockpit. The retired pilot, the one who had whispered before, leaned forward, almost pressing against the rope line. His voice carried more urgency now. "No, that's not random. She's running a pre-flight by memory. Watch her hands. They don't even hesitate." Deborah's voice, calm and clipped with authority, broke through the silence as she continued her checklist. Hydraulics, flaps, navigation system online. Each word rolled out like ritual, a language only seasoned aviators spoke. She reached for the throttle, and with one firm motion, the engines roared to life. The sound was thunderous, shaking the walls of the hangar, rattling champagne flutes, and forcing startled gasps from the guests. The jet's turbines whirred with power, filling the space with a raw, undeniable truth. This woman wasn't guessing. She knew exactly what she was doing. Deborah adjusted the headset and spoke again, her tone steady, professional, commanding. "Tower, Captain Williams commencing taxi to runway." The voice from the radio returned, warm with recognition. "Copy that, Captain. Runway 27 cleared for you." The hangar erupted, not with applause, but with chaos. Guests shouted over one another, disbelief colliding with awe. Some demanded to know who she really was. Others clutched at their phones, recording every second of what was unfolding. Whitmore's face had gone pale, though he fought to maintain his mask of arrogance. This is a stunt," he insisted, his words sharp with desperation. "She won't." But even as he spoke, the jet's wheels began to roll. The aircraft moved forward slowly, gracefully, its nose turning toward the yawning doors of the hangar. Deborah's hands never wavered, her focus unbroken. From her seat, she was no longer a woman in faded clothes. She was a captain, a commander of skies. The guests surged toward the windows and the edges of the hangar, straining to see as the Civjet taxied out into the night. The floodlights along the runway illuminated its sleek body, and for a moment, the plane seemed to gleam with something more than polish. It gleamed with dignity, with truth finally returning to its rightful owner. Inside, Deborah's breathing was steady. Her eyes scanned the horizon, every motion precise, controlled, confident. Her voice was low but certain as she whispered to herself, a mantra born of decades in the sky. "Engines stable, heading clear, we're ready." The engines roared louder, the sound rolling like thunder across the airfield. The suspense in the hangar was unbearable. Men who had laughed minutes before now gripped the rails with white knuckles. Women who had smirked turned wide-eyed, hearts hammering against their ribs. And at the center of it all, Richard Whitmore stood motionless, his confidence unraveling thread by thread. Then came the moment that shifted everything, the sound of acceleration. The jet surged forward down the runway, its power undeniable, its motion unstoppable. Deborah's hands held steady, her gaze locked ahead as the nose lifted, slow and graceful, before the entire aircraft broke free from the earth. The crowd gasped as the jet climbed into the sky, its lights cutting through the night like a blade of silver. And in that instant, every soul in the hangar understood the same truth. This was no act, no bluff, no illusion. Deborah Williams was no homeless nobody. She was something else entirely. The jet sliced through the night sky like a silver arrow, engines humming with the kind of power only hands that truly understood could command. Inside the hangar, people pressed against the glass walls, their breath fogging the panes as they craned their necks upward to follow the glowing lights that drifted higher and higher. The roar of the engines faded into the distance, replaced by a stunned silence so heavy it felt as though the air itself had thickened. Richard Whitmore stood in the center of it all, his jaw clenched, his confidence dissolving with each second the jet remained airborne. He had imagined laughter, collapse, and humiliation, but not like this. He had imagined her humiliation, not his own. Yet here he was, surrounded by peers who no longer laughed at his jokes, who now turned their eyes toward the sky with something he hadn't expected: reverence. Up above, Deborah sat steady in the cockpit, her hands moving across the controls with the ease of someone who had once done this every day of her life. Her eyes softened as the plane leveled off, the city lights sprawling beneath her like scattered jewels. It was as if the years melted away in that moment, years of silence, of loss, of being overlooked and forgotten. Here, in the captain's seat, she wasn't a woman dismissed as homeless or out of place. She was herself again. She was Captain Deborah Williams. Her headset crackled with life. "Captain Williams, systems check complete. Altitude steady at 10,000. It's good to hear your voice again." The tower operator's words weren't just formal. They carried warmth, familiarity, respect. Deborah's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Good to be back," she replied softly. For a moment she allowed herself to feel it, the pride of the skies, the dignity of command. She remembered faces of passengers she had once greeted, the children who had pressed their noses against windows as she lifted them above the clouds, the emergencies where her calm voice had kept hearts steady. Flying had never been just a job. It had been her calling. Down in the hangar, the murmurs grew louder, building like a wave. The retired pilot, who had been silent since she took off, now turned to the crowd, his voice shaking with awe. "That's not a trick. That woman, she's one of us. She's a real pilot. Do you hear me? A captain." Gasps broke out. Guests exchanged bewildered looks. Someone, he whispered, "But how? She looks like she's been living on the streets." Another answered, "Doesn't matter. Look at her up there. She flies like she was born in that cockpit." For the first time in years, Richard Whitmore's voice failed him. He opened his mouth to laugh, to dismiss, to retake control, but no words came. His throat was dry. His heart raced with something he didn't recognize: fear. The truth had revealed itself with undeniable clarity. This wasn't just a woman who knew about planes. This was a legend walking in flesh and bone, someone who had once carried thousands of lives safely through storms and skies. And now she had humiliated him, not with anger, not with revenge, but with undeniable skill, with a dignity he could never buy. Deborah's voice came over the radio again, this time audible to the onlookers in the hangar as someone piped the transmission through the speakers. Calm, professional, commanding. "Runway 27, preparing for descent." The crowd stirred, their disbelief turning into anticipation. Phones were raised, flashes went off, and every soul in the hangar leaned forward, waiting to witness the impossible conclusion. And in the silence that followed, Whitmore realized with a sickening weight that his laughter, the weapon he had always wielded to keep himself above others, had been stolen from him. The joke was gone, the crowd's loyalty was gone, and soon, his pride would crash harder than any plane ever could. Up in the cockpit, Deborah adjusted the controls, her eyes steady. "Let's bring her home," she whispered. And the descent began. The night air was sharp and alive with sound as the jet's landing lights cut through the darkness, twin beams glowing like eyes fixed on the runway ahead. Inside the hangar, the crowd had abandoned their glasses of champagne, their idle conversations, even their pretense of indifference. Every head was tilted skyward, dry breath held as the sleek silhouette of the jet approached for its descent. Deborah's hands were steady on the controls. Her voice was calm as she spoke into the headset, each word carrying the clipped precision of long-trained habit. Flap set, gear down, approach stable. The tower confirmed, its tone edged with excitement. Cleared to land, Captain Williams, winds calm, runway is yours. Her eyes softened. Runway is yours. How long had it been since those words had been spoken to her? The cockpit lights reflected in her gaze, and for a fleeting moment she was no longer a woman who had walked into a hangar in faded clothes, mocked and dismissed. She was who she had always been, a captain trusted with lives, respected for her skill, carrying dignity not even time could erase. The jet's engines roared as she guided it down with grace. Inside the hangar, people clutched one another's arms, holding their breath as the wheels touched the runway. A deep screech echoed across the field, then silence. Then the low rumble of rubber meeting asphalt as the jet settled firmly onto the ground. Deborah eased the throttle back, guiding the plane as though she were coaxing a stallion into a smooth trot. The descent was flawless, textbook perfect. The crowd erupted, not in laughter, but in applause, wild, thunderous applause that shook the hangar walls. Strangers clapped until their palms burned, some even shouting, "Bravo!" The retired pilot wiped at his eyes, whispering to no one in particular, "Still got it. She never lost it." Richard Whitmore stood frozen in the middle of it all. The applause wasn't for him. The spotlight, which he had always claimed so easily, had shifted completely. He looked around, desperate for even one ally in the sea of faces, but found only awe fixed on the jet rolling gracefully back toward them. His smirk had vanished. His skin was pale. His empire, of pride, built on arrogance and ridicule, was crumbling with every clap of their hands. The jet taxied to a stop in front of the hangar. Deborah shut down the engines, her movements still precise, her breathing steady. For a long moment she sat in silence, her hand resting gently on the throttle. The applause drifted faintly into the cockpit, muffled but undeniable. She allowed herself a single deep breath, eyes closing. "You're still here," she thought. "You never left." Then she rose, calm as ever, and stepped out of the cockpit. The hangar's massive doors framed her as she descended the stairs, the crowd parting instinctively as though she carried an aura too strong to be touched. The same people who had laughed at her minutes before now looked at her with reverence, with shame, with awe. Phones flashed like starlight as her shoes touched the polished floor again. And at the center, Whitmore tried to recover. He clapped his hands slowly, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges. "Well," he said loudly, his voice cracking, Quite the performance. You got lucky, ma'am. That's all this was. Luck." No one laughed. No one echoed him. His words fell flat, like stones dropped into an empty well. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. Their silence cut sharper than any insult. Deborah stopped in front of him. Her gaze was steady, her voice calm, but her words carried weight. "Luck doesn't keep hundreds of lives safe at 30,000 feet. Skill does, discipline does, and respect does. You wouldn't know about that, Mr. Whitmore." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whitmore's mouth opened, but no words came. He had been stripped bare, undone not by anger or cruelty, but by truth delivered with grace. For the first time in his life, Richard Whitmore, the man who thrived on humiliating others, felt the sting of humiliation himself, and unlike his victims, he had no dignity left to stand on. The applause began again, louder this time, echoing through the hangar like thunder, but it wasn't for him. It was for Deborah Williams, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had underestimated, the woman who had risen into the sky and come back down, carrying all the dignity he had tried to take away. And as the clapping roared around them, Whitmore realized with brutal clarity, the world no longer saw him as powerful. They saw him as small. The applause still thundered through the hangar when Deborah stood before Richard Whitmore, her worn jacket brushing softly against her sides as she breathed in the moment. The crowd wasn't cheering for wealth or arrogance or the glitter of money anymore. They were cheering for something far rarer, dignity that could not be broken. Slowly the voices quieted, faces leaned closer, eager now, not for spectacle, but for truth. The retired pilot who had been watching so intently finally stepped forward, his eyes shining. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I know who she is," he said. The words rippled through the silence. Whitmore stiffened. The crowd pressed in. The man's voice steadied, carrying across the hangar. "That woman, is Captain Deborah Williams, 30 years in the sky, one of the first black women to command international commercial flights, thousands of safe landings, dozens of emergencies handled without losing a single soul. I've seen her name in flight records. I've heard stories whispered in pilot lounges. She's a legend. Gasps broke out. People turned to Deborah, eyes wide, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The woman they had mocked as homeless, forgotten, unworthy, was the same woman who had once carried lives through storms and nights, who had once been trusted with the skies themselves. Deborah didn't speak right away. She let the truth hang in the air, her silence heavier than any defense she could give. Finally, she lifted her chin. "I flew for 47 years, she said quietly, her voice carrying with unexpected strength. Started as a flight instructor when no one believed women, let alone black women, belonged in a cockpit. I worked twice as hard for half the respect, and still, I flew. Through storms, through engine failures, through nights when passengers cried and prayed, I kept them safe, every single one." Her eyes swept the room, not in anger, but in calm remembrance. Then the world moved on. Airlines replaced experience with automation. I retired quietly, and life after flying was not kind. Her words struck the crowd like a blade. Some lowered their eyes in shame, remembering the cruel laughter they'd joined in only an hour ago. Whitmore's face burned, his arrogance collapsing into something raw. Panic, desperation, the sting of being exposed. Deborah continued, "But tonight, you all saw something you cannot unsee. Skill doesn't vanish. Dignity doesn't vanish. You can laugh at someone's clothes, their shoes, their face, but you cannot laugh away the truth of who they are." The hangar was silent again, not the silence of mockery, but of reverence. The applause had faded into something deeper, reflection. People weren't just watching a spectacle anymore. They were witnessing a reckoning. Whitmore tried to muster his voice. "So what? You flew a plane. Big deal. That doesn't..." But his words faltered. Even his own friends weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Deborah. His voice shrank under the weight of their silence, until he stopped altogether. The retired pilot turned toward Whitmore, his tone sharp. "Big deal? That woman did what 90% of people in this room couldn't dream of. You mocked her because you thought wealth made you powerful, but she just reminded you, true power is what no one can take from you." A murmur of agreement rose. Some clapped again, not in excitement, but in respect. Others nodded solemnly, chastened. Deborah looked at Whitmore one last time, her voice calm but firm. "You offered me your jet if I could fly it. I don't want it. What would I do with another possession to polish and boast about? I already have what you'll never own. Respect that was earned, not bought." The finality of her words hung in the air like a verdict. Whitmore's face twisted, his empire of pride shattered completely. For once in his life, there was no comeback, no laughter sharp enough to mask the emptiness behind it. The crowd parted as Deborah turned, lifting her duffel bag over her shoulder. She walked away slowly, her steps steady, her head high. The applause began once more, softer this time, but richer, filled with reverence that would outlast the night. And long after she had gone, her voice remained in their ears, her truth etched into their memory. For every person in that hangar had learned something unforgettable. Wealth could dazzle, arrogance could control a room, but dignity, quiet and unshakable, could change it forever.